whole issue of plagiarism and avoiding plagiarism and those kind of things. And so I've got an exercise for you to participate in today. But before we get there, I really kind of want to have a conversation with you about paraphrasing and kind of how this works in with direct quoting. And last time when we were talking, we spent a little bit of time discussing those issues of using direct quotes and the kind of problems that they can create for us, right? And that we start manipulating quotes, we start manipulating what the author's ideas are, we can get ourselves into trouble with those different types of plagiarism. So today, I want to talk to you about paraphrasing because this is what most of you are going to be doing, right? I mean, the whole purpose of writing this paper is to really synthesize that research down into manageable arguments so that the information can be compared, right? We're not going to spend our time summarizing these articles out, right? Because if we do that, there's no sense in writing the paper, and we don't. I know you can read an article and summarize it. So what we need to do is we need to practice synthesizing information, and we call that paraphrasing. And what I don't want you to do is to get confused as to what paraphrasing is. So I brought in this kind of example here because I thought this was a really, kind of a meaningful explanation as to what an acceptable and unacceptable paraphrase is. So here's this example from the original up on the top, and it says, something about personal space, right? It says different countries have different ideas about exactly how close is close, and it talks about all these different, ways of people responding to each other. And down here in this unacceptable paraphrase, and this comes out of a composition textbook, so that's the reason why I want you to see this. Down here in this example, notice that they say that this is an unacceptable paraphrase because the words exactly how close is close come out of the original, right? And so you're thinking to yourself, well, okay, we should just be putting those words in quotation marks in order to demonstrate that this is taken directly. That's not the point. The point that this text should be making is that this is not an attempt to synthesize the information at all. This isn't a paraphrase. This is an exercise in synonym making, right? And I want you to see what's going on here. This is plagiarism of the kind that is just, it's almost, I don't want to call it plagiarism because we could call this plagiarism, but what we've got is really an unethical representation of your own work. And what I mean by that is that all this does is just offer a different way to write this sentence, right? And if you're finding that you're trying to figure out a way to recraft a sentence so that it doesn't look like the original sentence, you got the whole idea wrong, right? And you need to be someplace else, right? You need to understand that our job is to not swipe information and try to make it look like we're not swiping information, right? Your job is to synthesize information down, boil it down into what you understand it to be in relationship to your argument. This whole thing, in my estimation, is plagiarism because unfortunately becomes regrettably. Different countries becomes different nations. Have different ideas about, think differently about, right? That is not an academic exercise at all, right? That's just an exercise in creating synonyms. That's why I look at this thing and I'm like, this is what someone's teaching other people, right? They're trying to teach that these words, right? These words that are underlined here are just a symptom of a much larger disease, right? The disease is that this writer has no control over the subject matter. This writer is just taking sentences and just reconstructing them in different ways so that it doesn't look like he's stealing. That's all it looks like to me. So what we need to do is we need to move away from this, concept of just, oh, how do I get away with this, to the whole understanding of how do you paraphrase information. And here's what you need to do. There's a 6-step process that you need to be thinking about when you paraphrase. All right, these 6 steps. This is how you synthesize information. Notice that I'm talking about synthesizing and paraphrasing kind of in the same vein. when you paraphrase, or when you're working on this paper, you should be thinking about doing this. You should be reading the article, rereading it, fully understanding it, digesting it to such a way that you know exactly what that article is talking about without having to look at it. Sure, do you need to go and like look at some of the data and some of the numbers in order to figure out what the data, can be, how they can be used in order to help you make your argument more quantitatively based? Sure, that stuff is in there and you can use that. But for the purposes of paraphrasing and discussing the article, you need to know what the article says. And that's what a lot of people, college students think that, oh, I don't have time to do all this. Yeah, well, you're going to have to make the time to do it, right? Read that article, understand what it says so that you can talk about it intelligently. Right? If you can just close the book and someone can, have a conversation with you about it, and you should be able to talk about that article and what it means. So when you begin to write, before you even begin to write, I would say step 2 is close that book, turn that photocopy over, shut that computer screen off, right? Don't look at it. Because if you're looking at the original, you're going to end up doing this regrettably versus unfortunately. Different nations, different country. You're going to just be tied to the original source. And when we get into our exercise today, I'm going to have, it's like a little exercise in psychology, right? I'm going to put the sample up here and ask you to paraphrase it. And half of you are going to sit there and look at that thing while you're writing. And I'm going to say, don't look at it, right? You don't have to look at it. If you can read and understand what it means, you don't have to look at it in order to write about it, right? I mean, that's what this whole exercise is. But you'll do it anyways, and that's the reason why you'll end up in my office, and we'll have to, have a conversation over tears about plagiarism issues, right? I'm not interested in having those conversations. I'm interested in stemming that right now, right? I want you to understand the principle of how to write about research, and it's not about just copying, right, and making something look different. So step 1, read it and understand it. Step 2, get it out of your line of sight before you begin writing. Step 3, make some notes about what it is that you want to accomplish with this. In other words, what were some of the pertinent facts or some of the certain ideas? Maybe jot down some little notes to yourself, right, about what you want to do with this, or what were some of the highlights or some of the purposes that you want to emphasize. Maybe make those notes to yourself. And then, at that point, write your paraphrase. So somewhere between step 3 and step 4, you're going to write the actual paraphrase. Notice that I didn't even include it as part of the 6 steps, right? I'm just assuming you're going to do all these other things. So read it, understand it, get it out of your line of sight, make some notes so that you can write it. Step 4 would be, now what you need to do is turn that computer screen back on, turn that document back over so you can read it, and now you need to look at 2 things. Step 4 would be, look to make sure that you're not using any of the language directly out of the source. We all have reading comprehension skills. You will remember words and phrases from the article that you read. You just want to make sure that those words and phrases, if they come back into your paraphrase or into your synthesis, that you identify them as such. If you have to use direct quotes, great. If you have to just reconstruct the sentence to get that language out of there, go ahead and do that. It's fine. And step 5, you have to read your source or your synthesis against the original source to make sure that what you have written is accurate in the author's representation of ideas, right? We talked about misrepresentation as a form of plagiarism the other day, right? And what we're going to find out today when I put you through this exercise of reading this passage, right, that you're going to make mistakes. You're going to start putting information in there. You're going to tell me that the author said something that the author didn't say. And that's a form of plagiarism. And then step 6 would be, make sure you are appropriately inserting the citations to represent who owns what. If you want to make transitions about what your ideas about this writing are, great, you do that, and you just make sure that none of that information is associated with the author. So as a way to help you guide this principle, right, you should be in the habit of explaining what the author is doing, not just reproducing the text. You want to describe what the author did. So I would recommend for point number 6, in order to get you on the right track, set the paper in motion by introducing the author. Like, according to Jones in his study, Jones claims this, right? So that you're putting in the right perspective. You're writing from the perspective to tell me what Jones did. What happens in that example I put up on the board is that's just reproducing what the source said. We're not interested in reading the reproduction, right? If I wanted to read something that was that close, why would I want to read your reproduction of it? Just give me the original. I'll read that. There's no intellectual exercise in just trying to manipulate words. So put yourself in a position of introducing that source and keeping focus, like I showed you the example the other day. Jones claims this, and in the study they found this, right? Putting yourself in the position to constantly describe what's going on in the study instead of just reproducing the passage. Those 6 steps will save you the agony of having to go through those very difficult conversations about plagiarism with me, right? Think about it from that perspective, and you'll be fine. All right. What I've got up here is a passage. This is in the textbook, but it's on page 213 if any of you have your textbook. But if you don't have your textbook, and I don't expect you to look at it, you can read it here and still get the same effect. All right. Can you read that? Okay. I want you to approach this passage with those 6 steps that I just explained to you, right? Read it, understand it, don't look at it. Jot yourself some notes if you need to, write your passage, go back and look for language, go back and look for the representation of ideas, and make sure that you've cited it accurately. All right? And then once you're done writing your paraphrase, writing the synthesis, I want to put examples up on the overhead, and I want us as a class to critique them, because we're going to find examples of plagiarism today. All right, let's see what you can do. Synthesize this down. If you find yourself writing sentence by sentence, line by line repetitions of what the author did, you're doing it wrong. Right? That's not a paraphrase. That's called cheating. Can you start off your passage with according to the University of Michigan time analysis data? Can you say that? No, why not? Two reasons why.
You're just switching the sentence around.
Right? You're starting off by going line by line, right? So if you're starting off in that direction, you're already in the wrong, you've got one foot in the grave, right? Because you're now going to just go sentence by sentence. You're just looking at the first line, you're going to just write summaries of each line or change the wording of each line. That's a problem. But also, do you have your hands on the University of Michigan time analysis data? What do you have your hands on? Brooks, right? This is the article, The Organizational Kid from the Atlantic. This is Brooks' idea, right? He's just using the University of Michigan time analysis. Do you know what the University of Michigan time analysis data are, by the way? Every year, the University of Michigan essentially does a profile of what the average 18-year-old looks like going into college, and they send that information out to faculty across the country so that we get an idea of kind of who you are and how you operate, right? Because essentially, you've probably been in those classes where, some guy trots out a record player in his Bruce Springsteen albums and for some reason thinks that that's somehow going to be relevant to you, right? When in actuality, you could probably care less about who Bruce Springsteen is, or anything that he's writing about in his music probably doesn't have any relevance to your lives. So the point of all of this is to say that we as a faculty don't know who our audience is a lot because of an age difference, generation gap, right? So you may be getting your news from things like, Twitter or, some other kind of electronic format, social media site, where we're getting our news from, newspapers. So what you are seeing and what we're seeing might not be the same thing. That, they tell us about, who's relevant in pop culture. They tell us about who's essentially, we have a perspective on things, that someone said something the other day which just kind of blew me away about this, and that was, no one teaches the end of the Cold War in history classes anymore. In other words, when Reagan was president and he put all the pressure on the Russians to try to keep up with our space program, right? He essentially just put Russia into bankruptcy, right? Which forced the collapse of communism all across Europe and Asia, right? And essentially that was the speech, tear down that wall, right? That was the wall between East and West Germany, or East and West Berlin in Germany. Essentially, people talk about that in my generation because that was a really important time. That was the end of communism, right? It was the end of the Cold War. But essentially, when we talk to you, you weren't even born then, right? And we're thinking about it from our perspective of what an important factor that is. And it seems like because it was part of our lives, we don't really write about that or think about that in terms of teaching history because was so current to us. To you, it's as foreign as World War II or World War I because you just don't have any association with it. You weren't even born there yet, right? So you wouldn't even know about those events. Even if you were born, it wouldn't matter. You wouldn't have any comprehension of it. So essentially what we need to be able to do is to understand you. That's what the University of Michigan time analysis do. So essentially this is an article about how you're different than we are. So what does the article say? You can't write until you can tell me what this says. What's the article say? Sarah?
That the youth of today are unique in the way that they spend their time as compared to previous generations.
Okay, and so what do? What's so unique about your generation? Anyway.
They're saying that we're more matured at this age by the time compared to like.
Is it saying anything about maturity in there? Is he saying that it's better than, right? I mean, because that's a thing that people are going to get into trouble with here when you're starting to write a paraphrase. He's not saying that this is a better way of approaching life. He's just saying this is a different way of approaching life. And when you start to say maturity, I don't see anything in here about maturity. I just think that you're talking about adult-oriented structured activities. In other words, they're supervised by adults. Your generation is the first generation where people, like when I was growing up, when Saturday morning came around, right, my mother just said, it's 8 o'clock, it's time for you to get out and go play, right? And so she didn't want me sitting in front of the television, so we just went outside. I mean, and my parents didn't think twice about just packing a lunch and saying, okay, you know, you want to take a 8-mile bike ride down to another town? Go ahead. We'll see you, you know, this afternoon. I was like 8 years old, and my mother was packing me lunches and putting, you know, taping a fishing pole to my bike and saying, all right, here, go have fun. All right? I mean, today, it's like the opposite, right? It's that you don't go and do anything unless your parents are driving you there, where you're being coached by someone. There's, you know, there's sports teams, there's music lessons, there's dance recitals, there's all this kind of stuff that's all adult-oriented and supervised, right? Now, some people are going to look at that and say, okay, that makes sense because, you know, we want to protect these kids or we want to train these kids. And essentially, you know, they talk about this achievement, you know, issue, right? That they're achievement obsessed because we've trained them to be that way. You know, we want you to not be wasting your lives, right? I mean, and again, there's kind of an interesting perspective on parenting right there. So from the perspective of some parents, right, letting your kids out and just letting them run loose, saying be home when the street lights come on, right? Some people might look at that and say, wow, what a reckless, you know, childhood that is, right? And can you trust the kids to make good decisions and bad things going to happen? Well, yeah, probably. Bad things could probably happen. But does it teach kids then, I mean, you want to put judgment on this, I look at it in the opposite direction. Because we had that freedom, because we were essentially just told to go out and survive on our own, it made us much more social beings where we had to essentially discover and correct the problems amongst ourselves. We didn't have an adult to intervene. I mean, I remember when I first moved to my hometown and I have the, you know, this park right next to my house, and I took a couple of hockey nets over there to the park, and, you know, there's a bunch of kids over at the park, they were just sitting around doing nothing. So I took some hockey, they had a, you know, big pile of hockey sticks and some balls and some nets. I took them over there and said, hey, you guys want to play hockey? And, you know, I put the nets out. And so within 5 minutes, these kids were trying to kill each other with sticks, right? And I'm sitting there looking around going, you know, what just happened? Like when I was a kid, everybody got together, you played street hockey, and you could be out there all day. I look at this situation, I'm thinking, because there was no adult refereeing and nobody to tell them what the rules are, they couldn't operate by themselves. So there's no judgment here on about what's good and what's not good. Essentially what he's saying is that generations are different. So write your paraphrase. Synthesis. I was at a meeting one time with one of our administrators. He's an older guy, you know, and he was sitting there talking about how generations are different and stuff, and he, you know, came into this meeting with this idea where he was really frustrated with students, and he came out with this great line that I'll never forget when he goes, yeah, he's like, these kids are hard to reach. He goes, they just don't understand the language of the 60s, like 1960s. And I just about fell off my chair, and I said, why would they? It was 50 years ago, right? You know, they have no association, from his perspective, right? The 60s were a formative time of his development, right? Peace, love, man, no rules, right? Everybody's gonna smoke pot and sell t-shirts on a boardwalk or something, right? But in this generation, right, we're trying to get you, if you can think about it, right? I mean, the whole reason for this thing being written is that we don't want you to end up misdirected, right? And that's what the problem was in the 60s, was that parents just said, yeah, I'm not going to put any rules. Your rules are bad, man. We don't want to do anything to kids, just stifle them, right? And so what we did, we turned this whole thing around. We created all sorts of rules and all sorts of restrictions. see language coming up, like, goal-oriented activities and that kind of stuff. I feel like they're too close to the type of text. Just tell me what's going on. Don't look at it. You don't have to look at it right. If you can read, then you don't need to look at it to write about it, right? Make sure you set yourself up to make sure that this is all Brooks' idea, right? You want to put this in a perspective. You're telling me what Brooks is doing, not just synthesizing it. Put yourself right from the perspective of telling me what Brooks is doing. Right? So introduce that source right up in the front. Keep it focused on this is Brooks' idea. This is an exercise in the course. I'm going to teach you to paraphrase. Right? Get all that. You find yourself having to use the language directly from the original. Throw it in. Anybody feel we've got a good paraphrase written? Look, we're gonna make mistakes. Let's just find out if there's, how bad the mistakes are. All right, that's what we want to do. All right, let's take a look at a couple of examples. I'm not saying anything about these examples other than the fact that they are examples. I want you to tell me what you think about them. You with me? All right, let's start here. So we also have to remember we've got to clean up diction and all that kind of stuff, but as operate with this, right? So Brooks states, now, as soon as you mention Brooks, you've got to get that citation in there, right? So as soon as you put Brooks, you got to put that number in. Brooks states that there's a generational gap between professors and students. Did Brooks say that? No, that's plagiarism, right? You just told me something that Brooks didn't state. Brooks doesn't make any mentions about professors. Right? That's a misrepresentation of the author's ideas. Boom, paper's done. Told you, right? You're going to make mistakes. That's why we're doing this. And we're going to do it again on Wednesday as well, practice, all right? So that you don't make these mistakes. Let's read it on, find out what else is going on. Today's college students are used to being supported by adults in everything the students have done from childhood to college. Is that right? Yeah, I mean, it's in the ballpark. Whose idea is that? How do you know? You don't. There's nothing in here to associate this sentence with Brooks as the author, right? This idea is essentially yours because you don't have a number in there and there's nothing in here to say, like this Brooks analysis says this or anything else, right? There's no clear and obvious association with the source that you just introduced. Because that sentence does not have a number next to it, it doesn't have any language to associate it with Brooks and his study, that sentence is yours, and I'm going to tell you that sentence is not yours. Strike two. Right? And as the final one, as a result, the students are driven to success and rely on guidance by adults. And that one's cited, right? But just because you introduce an author here and you put a number down here, that doesn't cover everything in between. That second sentence right there is left unguarded. Citations are sentence specific. They belong to one sentence only. You need to make sure that you are doing your job to associate a sentence. That if it does not have a number, you need to associate that sentence with the source somehow. Everybody see that? Conceptually, it's a synthesis, but it makes two critical mistakes, right? The first sentence isn't accurate, the second sentence is unguarded. Let's take a look at another example. Okay, I'm gonna have to look at this one from here. According to Brooks, comma, citation. Parents have set new standards for kids of this generation to meet. So far, so good? Good. These students may not have been, what is that?
These standards.
What?
Standards.
No, standard, what did you read? These students may not have been, what's that word?
That's a standard.
That says standards?
No,
Oh, thank you. Okay. It's a failure of communication. These standards may not have been met by parents themselves, but are expected of this new generation. We're still on task? Is that sentence an extension, clearly and obviously, of Brooks' source? Is there anything in there to associate with Brooks? The standards, right? There's the link. He set me up to say that parents have set new standards and that these standards may have not been met. So I don't have to put a citation after that second sentence because I know it's an extension of the first sentence we were just talking about. These new expectations shape individuals into socially, what's that word? Intact? I don't know.
Let's see.
No, socially, all right, so they shape, all right, here it is. It says,
To socially interact.
yeah, these expectations shape individuals to socially interact differently than the individuals in the past. Does he need a citation there to associate it with Brooks? Where is it? Do the expectations, when he talks about new expectations, does this link with that previous sentence? Is a clear and obvious extension? Clear and obvious? Probably not. I would, just to be on the safe side, stick the number in there at the end of this sentence because it doesn't necessarily show me the clear association with the sentence before it. I could interpret this as being your assessment of it. Conceptually, does it synthesize the passage? Yep. Okay. Take a look at another one. We gotta do a little navigating in order to get to this one. So Brooks reports that college-age students of today possess the most unindependent lifestyle in comparison to previous generations before them. Is that what Brooks says? Does he call them unindependent? Why don't we say dependent instead of unindependent? Right? So it's a dependent group. Are they a dependent generation? Is that what Brooks says? Is he making the point in here? They're structured, there's adult activities, they're home, they're supervised, they're deferential to authority, they're group-oriented, they're achievement-obsessed. Does it say anything about them being dependent? I don't think we can say that. So let's take out the double negative there and just call them dependent. That may be a problem, right? Because I don't think Brooks is talking about whether they're dependent on anything. I think Brooks is saying they're just operating by a different set of, I don't know if I want to say standards, but they've been trained to be something different. All right, so that first sentence, that's borderline. Most of this can be attributed to adults conditioning college-age students of today to base decisions of daily life off of established rules and standards set forth by parents of college students' lives. Most of this can be attributed to adults conditioning college students to base decisions on established rules. Is that what Brooks says? Is this a clear and obvious extension of the sentence before it? That most of this, right? I mean, does this do the job? Most of this can be attributed? Probably. I can get an association with that. Is it an accurate synthesis of the passage? The bottom half seems to be more accurate than the top half. Close, not bad. All right, Brooks states, gotta get that citation right there, right? Brooks states, the parents of college-age students forced more responsibility on their children when their children were growing up. Does Brooks say that? Does Brooks say anything about forcing responsibility on them? Force is a pretty powerful word, right? I would probably take issue with that word right there. I don't think there's any forcing going on. I think it's just the way they're raised. It's not like all kids are wanting to do one thing and then the parents are like forcing them to break their habits, right? It's just when you're raised, you don't know any different. These parents bestow this authoritative personality with strict parental supervision. Is that what Brooks says? Yeah, adult-oriented activities, supervised, that kind of stuff. I can get that. Is there an association of this sentence with Brooks? When I read that, these parents bestow this authoritative personality with strict parental supervision, am I clear that that information comes from Brooks? Probably not. Maybe. I'm not so sure. I wouldn't fault you if you put a number in there. I probably wouldn't stop reading at this point because I would say, yeah, you're kind of borderline. This aspect of responsibility leads to college-age students being able to participate in activities with other generations. Did Brooks say anything about college students participating with other generations? No. But that information doesn't have a citation with it. But it seems like it's an extension of the Brooks source. See the confusion right here? I'm reading this last sentence and I'm thinking to myself, that sounds like something that you're interpreting out of this. But because this aspect of responsibility leads to, you're trying to associate it with what Brooks was doing, and because it doesn't have a citation, I'm thinking to myself, is that your idea? Is that Brooks' idea? I don't know. It was a problem with this sentence. Now it's a bigger problem here because I don't know who owns what. I don't know if you're talking about Brooks anymore or talking about from your own perspective and interpreting. Yeah.
So if you're interpreting something,
which you are in this paper, right? You need to transition to that point. So whenever you begin your transition, what I would do in order to make sure that it's clearly represented to the author or to the reader, I would put your little number maybe at the end of this sentence. And if this is an interpretation sentence, leave this one unguarded, and now you don't have any confusion there. Right? Draw a line between the end of the source that you're using and your interpretation.
like if you're interpreting something, but you're basing your interpretation off of like data that you're given, how
you need to make it clear. Put that number in there where the information from the source ends, and so you get that number in there to end it so that the rest of the sentence, which is unguarded, is your interpretation.
Okay.
Make it clear.
So like when we're doing our paper, our interpretation would be like, oh, this is more efficacious than the other, like that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Okay.
Right, and that's not the author's idea, that's your idea, right? And what I would do, I mean, if you find a source out there, let's say you find a source that is making that point too, right? Saying that treatment A is better than treatment B, right? They're doing the comparison. You found an article that's doing the comparison that you want. And if they're making that same point, what you can do is you can just say, that Jones' claim that A is better than B is accurate because, right? Because you want to make sure that you're giving credit to the fact that Jones came up with this idea, right? Jones already did the comparison and found that A is better than B, and you're agreeing with it, right? So you're just making an assessment that Jones' claim is accurate because he showed these types of results. You're giving the judgment, right? And you're doing the same kind of thing. You're judging and looking at it the same way Jones did. Okay. We have a little bit more to learn about this, and we'll do so on today, Wednesday, right? I'm going to come in here again with another passage on Wednesday to talk to you about how to use data. So I'm going to give you a passage that's going to have numbers and scientific data in it, and now we're going to have to use those data and write a paraphrase at the same time. So that's going to kind of complicate things, but it'll be a good exercise. All right. See you on Wednesday.